Okay, what's your name?
My name is David Sanford Hanson. I was born
Well,
in.
wait, stop. I'm going to ask the questions, okay? Just want to keep it. That's the first question, by the way. So, where were you born?
I was born in Southside Hospital, Bayshore, Long Island, New York, October 23rd, 1938.
So, how old are you now?
I am 82 years old.
When did you leave Bayshore?
Well, my family, including Auntie Anne and Auntie Nancy, came to Bridgehampton in 1946.
Why did you leave? Why did you come to Bridgehampton?
Living in Bridgehampton at the time were my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, and Grandma Lina had taken ill, and my mother felt it was necessary to move to Bridgehampton where she could be next to her to care for her in her latter years, which actually Nana Sanford died, I think, 2 years after we moved out.
But she was the primary reason. And you stayed here. You didn't go back to
And we
Bayshore.
came here to live on a full-time basis, yes.
So what was life like in Bridgehampton then? And that was like, what year was that?
Well, 1946 and 47, Bridgehampton was, I'd say, 75 to 80% farmland. Acre after acre of potatoes, corn, various other things, but mostly potatoes.
So you knew your maternal grandparents pretty well.
I knew Grandpa Sanford and Nana Sanford, although not for very long. She passed away not long after we got here. I'd say maybe a year or two later.
How about your paternal grandparents?
My paternal grandparents lived in Greenport, Long Island, where they emigrated to in around 1895, in that range. I'm not sure exactly. From Norway, came directly from Norway. And my understanding is that Grandpa Hanson had a work opportunity in this country, out in Long Island, caring for an estate owned by a Rockefeller. And that's where he emigrated to with his wife and 3-year-old son, who was my father, James Hanson.
What is your grandfather's full name? And your paternal grandmother's full name?
I believe, well, my grandfather's name was Anton Hanson. He was always called Tony by people who knew him in that era. And my grandmother, I believe, was Angela, although I'm not sure of that. And I remember we would drive over to Greenport, up through Riverhead and out through all the farming communities to Greenport to visit. I remember going there with Anne, possibly early on with Nancy, but later on, Nancy being 6.5 years older, she was probably off to college. So I remember going to their house in Greenport, and in the back there was a garage, which I was never allowed to go see for some reason. And inside the house were these artifacts, and I remember actually being tentative when I was in the house. I was basically warned not to wander. Certain rooms I was not to go to. I remember there being a big radio in the, I guess, the living room. And I remember eating wonderful food prepared by Nana Hanson. We didn't call her Nana, she was Grandma Hanson.
What kind of foods?
I don't know.
Norwegian?
It was something I liked to eat. And at that stage of my life, I was not a fish eater. I did not like any kind of fish. My mother, I think, had forced me to eat tuna fish at one point, and from that point on, I had no desire to eat fish of any type. I don't think I actually turned that page until I was about 23 or 24, where Grandma Pat introduced me to some fish, and I actually liked it, and it turned around from that point on. But at that early age, I can't remember what it is, but obviously it was something that I liked to eat because I did eat it.
But the foods that were prepared, were they of a Norwegian origin or just a local origin?
I would guess local origin. I know there was food prepared which my father ate and my grandparents ate, and I didn't. But I couldn't tell you what it was.
So Anton was born in Norway, and your grandmother, your paternal grandmother, was also born in Norway.
That's
But
right.
they came over together. They didn't meet here.
That's correct. With Grandpa Hanson on a boat.
Did they ever visit Norway after coming here?
I don't believe they ever went back. No.
And your father, did he visit Norway?
No.
Have you visited Norway?
I actually have not either. I've visited most all the other countries in Europe, but haven't done Norway yet.
So what was it like being Norwegian out here in Long Island? I mean, how much of the Norwegian culture were you exposed to out here? Other than...
Hardly any.
Yeah.
Hardly any.
Did they tell you stories of Norway or the journey across, or?
My father was almost 50 years older than I, and he had become well, let's put it this way, one who didn't spend a lot of time with me or Ann, for that matter, about his life. And so I have very little recollection of what happened, I guess, until I started to become 8 to 10 years old and so forth. I know he served in the Army Air Corps in World War I, never went to France, got out just in time when he was all set to go, and then the armistice. He had gone to Texas for flight training, and I've been to that Air Force base, so I know where it was that he did that training.
What's the name of the Air Force base?
Kelly Air Force Base, but then it was Kelly Field back in that time, outside of San Antonio.
Okay.
And so I know about that. We actually found his uniform in the attic of Grandpa Sanford's house on Ocean Road. Ann and I believe she's donated it to the local museum. His uniform. He was a second lieutenant. He told one story, as I recall, about in flight training. He flew a type of plane, I think it was like a Jenny, that had a second passenger, usually a sergeant, who acted as a gunner and navigator. And so one day they were flying and something happened to the engine, conked out, and they wound up landing in a hedge. Now, you have to understand that down around San Antonio, land's very flat. So I don't think finding a place to land was an issue, although they did land in this hedge. And my father tells the story of getting out and ordering the sergeant to stay with the plane, while he then, on foot, went back to where he could find a phone and call and get people to come retrieve the airplane. That's the only story that he ever told that I remember about his experience in flight training.
So he was, what year was he born?
I believe it was 1890.
So he was 26 or so, 27
Right.
in the Army Air Corps.
Right, right.
Did he go to college before going into the service?
So what I understand about this is that the wealthy man who owned the estate that Grandpa Anton worked as the estate manager, we'd call him today, that my father was brilliant when it came to studies and education. He was tops of his class in grade school and high school, and upon graduation, you have to also realize that Grandpa Hanson and Grandma Hanson, they didn't have a lot of money. He made enough to live on. He had a nice house and everything else. But when it came to going off to college, back in those days, it was pretty expensive. I don't know that they had scholarships or things like that. So the man who owned the estate arranged to have my father go to college in Chicago at what at the time was called Armour Institute, obviously named for the Armour meatpacking family, and that's where he was enrolled. That college today is known as the University of Chicago. So this would be like being sent to MIT. And clearly, my father's scholastic achievements up to that point warranted that type of an assignment. He did not graduate. I don't know how many years he was there, but that's where he went to college. I do know that he joined a fraternity. And later years, after we'd moved to Bridgehampton and were living at the Ocean Roadhouse, across the street to the west, up Paul's Lane, is a large home on an estate, and the owner of that estate is named John Muller. John Muller, it so happened, was a member of the same fraternity as Grandpa Hanson. So Mr. Muller would come over once a month just to go into the living room. They'd close the doors and be in there for an hour or so, I'm sure reminiscing and talking about various things that fellow members of fraternity would talk about. John Muller was a big man with a deep barrel voice, and he scared me when he would come into the house with his "Hello, Dave," and so forth. I remember that clearly.
So your father, he concluded his college in what year we don't know.
I have not a clue, no idea.
But then there were 2 or 3 years before World War I, right? I assume, and so he was living back in Greenport.
I don't know where he was living.
Okay. How did your father meet your mother?
Well, Aunt Marie, I'm not sure, she's probably a cousin, I'm assuming on my father's side, I don't know, but there was an Aunt Marie who had a home in Bayshore. on the water. I remember going there visiting. It was wonderful. My mother was a school teacher at the time in Bayshore, and I believe Aunt Marie was a school teacher as well, but she knew Jim Hansen. Don't ask me how that connection took place, but she knew. So she put Jim Hansen and Florence Sanford together.
But what's your father's birth name?
My father's birth name is James Henry Hansen.
It's Jens.
James Henry Hansen. Grandpa Hansen had nothing to do with Americanizing or not Americanizing his family. He said, I'm an American now, so I will conform to American ways, and if it was Jens in Norway, it's James in America.
Well, okay, but
I don't know that for sure, but that's a pretty good guess.
So you told me also he worked in Sag Harbor after when you were a teenager. And what was the name of that shop in Sag Harbor? You said he was a machinist.
So during the Second World War, my father is now past 50, 60, and he had worked for New Departure Ball Bearings in New Haven, Connecticut during the war. And he would travel from Bayshore to Bridgeport, take a ferry to, he would travel to Port Jefferson, take a ferry to Bridgeport, and from there on to work at the ball bearing facility in New Haven, Connecticut. He would do that every week. I'm assuming maybe a couple of weeks of vacation, but during the years of 1946 until 1947, at some point he went to work there, and I'm not sure when that was, 1940, 41, it could have been somewhere along that line. He had been there for a few years. So after we moved to Bridgehampton, he was able to arrange a transfer to a subsidiary factory in Sag Harbor, New York. So when the family moved out from Bayshore to Bridgehampton, he was able to go to work almost right away at the New Departure Ball Bearings facility in Sag Harbor.
So he would be gone for the week and come back on the weekends.
When working in Connecticut, he was gone for the week and back on weekends. But once we moved to Bridgehampton, then obviously we drive back and forth to Sag Harbor.
I see. And you said you would pick him up.
Well, after I got my license, so that would have been for 1954, 55, I was able to drive and pick him up at work.
So what was a typical day as a kid at the Ocean Road house for the family? What was a typical day?
Well, you have to understand that Bridgehampton School was very, very small. Less than 300 students in all 12 grades combined. More like 250. I graduated with 16. We had 12 diplomas and 4 certificates. I graduated with 16, a class of 16. 16. People can't believe that. I never had a car, so I wasn't very mobile, but I did have the barn which was on our property. And I would find things to do in the barn. I can remember there being a big open space over, wasn't the big storage area, but the extension of the barn. And I would go up there and set up a hockey rink and take a tennis ball and a stick that I'd attach to a small piece of board to make into a hockey stick, and I remember shooting pucks into the hockey stick, into the net. We had a game, there's a very large angled roof to the south side of the south part of the barn, and we would play this game with tennis balls, and we had paddles, and you'd hit the ball on the roof, and when it would come down, the other player would try to hit it back. We would play that kind of game. During the summer, I have vague recollection of this, but we lived on Grandpa Sanford's farm. And Grandpa Sanford's farm included this large barn for storing hay and so forth. And then there was outbuildings. There was a chicken house, and there was another house, small bungalow. And they made over the chicken house into living quarters, and we would stay in the chicken house during the summer while the big house was rented. And I remember being in the chicken house, but I was surprised to learn not that many years ago that we used to rent the big house. And I guess I was warned never to go over there during the summer when tenants were around, because I don't remember meeting them or anything like that.
And did you?
But not being mobile, not having a car, down up the road was a kid named Jack Musnicki. The Musnickis were big farmers. In the area, there were 5 boys. 4 of them were farmers, and the other one was an attorney, I think. And they had farmland all over the place. You go down Ocean Road, past Bridge Lane, and on the right, there was nothing. After the Muller House, there was nothing till you got to Maycox Road. Nothing but farmland. That's all homes today. So it was a big farm, and I would go over there, and Jack and we would go back there and just wander, be around when the farmers were doing their work. I remember one day they killed a turkey. They chopped its head off and let it run around without a head. I remember that experience. Particularly pleasant. But Jack he and I would find things to do. I played with him a lot. I really did. He was a year younger than me, in the same class as Carl Yastrzemski, actually. First time I met Carl Yastrzemski was going over to Jack's house one day, and Carl was over there. The parents were Polish. Carl's parents were Polish, so they knew each other, and so it decided Carl would come spend the day at Jack's place. I remember meeting him for the first time. Of course, I'd see him in school. And Jack had his dog, I had my dog. We'd spend a lot of time. And I would spend a lot of time going down to the pond with Watermilly, the dog, and just wandering around and seeing things. Whereas a lot of the other kids would be closer to the village, and they'd be at the candy kitchen or things like that, but not me. I was.
But did you play with your sisters?
Not very much, really. She was 2 classes behind me. And, she had her own. Anne had her own things to do.
And Nancy was?
Nancy, 6.5 years older. She was, if not in high school, she was going out after that. So.
Okay, last question. What do you want to tell your grandchildren? What life message?
Well, I guess something to the effect that your mama and papa are happily married. I was happily married to Grandma Pat. My grandparents were married and had long marriages. I worry about instability when it comes to the commitment of marriage. I would hope that my children are have good ideals, good thoughts, are committed to living good lives, and that comes to fair and equal treatment of everyone. You know, I grew up with blacks in my class, not Hispanics so much. That was more California, I guess. But and we never had any difficulties of a racial nature. Never once. Wilbert Ward was in my class. Wilbert Ward was one of the Ward kids. Tom was older. Chubby, they called him, was younger. And Wilbert was exceptional. We would have spelling bees in class, and Patty Brennan was the smartest one in the class. She was also played with the boys. She was an athlete. I think she's still in California, where she was head of the athletic department at a school. So she carried that through the life. So they'd have spelling bees, and it would come down to between Patty and Wilbert Ward. And Wilbert Ward would win his fair share. So clearly he had a brain. He played on the basketball team. And just a great kid. Life turned not well for him later as he moved into New York City. And I hate to say this, but he was found one night in an alley, murdered, stab wounds. I don't know what he got into. But I saw him before then on one of my visits back. Rick DePetris was another story in my life, one of my classmates who was in my wedding. We decided to go towards Southampton to this I call it like a roadhouse. This is where blacks went. Unfortunately, separate. Anyway, and who I run into there but Wilbur. We're hugging and how you doing? And it was just a wonderful reunion. And this is a time when the events were going on in Birmingham and black people being whipped and everything else. And I remember Wilbur looked at me and he said, Dave, he said, I don't understand what's going on down there. Because we never had those kind of problems. That has stayed with me all these years. I'll never forget his words. But today it's we still have racial issues and things are not equal, and I don't know if it's ever going to change. But at least for that period in my life, I never really appreciated it because we just didn't have that situation in our school. Butch Green, the Greens, great people. One of their sisters catered Jim McCaffrey's wedding a couple of times. They're just great people. Anyway.
Any final thoughts to your grandkids?
Just live good, respectable lives. Treat others as you treat yourself. In all cases, be patient. Give people opportunity. We're all different to a degree, and the more we get to understand each other and our differences, the better we're going to be along. But just marry well, have a lot of kids, and just remember old Grandpa Dave as having started this whole thing off. Okay.
All right. All right, that's it. How do you feel?
I feel good. I feel good. So have you looked at any of the recording?
I downloaded them. There's a lot of them, but I can give it back to you. I can give you the whole
Well,
thing.
no, keep the chip.
I already downloaded it. I backed it up to my hard drive, so you can keep it all. I have it. I'll get it for you.
Well, you can still keep the chip. I gave you another chip to put in, a fresh one for me to
Okay.
use.
I have, like I said, I got an external hard drive, so I downloaded all the video. I got it all.
Whatever you want to do.
Okay, son is awake.
Where's Margie?
Give her some of those O's in that bag. Let Grandpa do it.
Some O's.